where are we now? What is required? What are the critical and key factors for us to be able to achieve that? And I think thank you for the opportunity. I would really, when the OAU began in 1963, it was a time when the world was, there were major transformation in the global shifts in the global world that we live in. And today we are also living in an age where it's precipitated by major transformation. And you want to ask oneself, what can I do? What can I as an African do to contribute to the changing world and the changing landscape? And what is my role? So once again, key, to begin with Agenda 2063, the 7 aspirations of the Africa we want, because it's critical as any institution, any continent, any country, and as a people and nation, for us to have a clear vision of what it is we want to achieve before we embark on this journey. So as the journey continues after 60 years of the unity of Africa, having come through a period of colonization and great oppression, the people, I'm blessed to have to work in South Africa, to be born as South African and as an African, having received the blessing from none other than the Honorable Nelson Mandela, who was the father of our democracy in South Africa. So the program, as I serve as the founder chief executive, Leading Like Mandela, was established to continue the leadership legacy of great African leaders and to develop our current and future leaders to continue that legacy. Hence, as Nelson Mandela said, it is in your hands now, because the future of Africa is in our hands. If we as Africans do not stand up and take and play a key role, just as the founding members of the OAU, the African Union, and the great leaders of Africa and our liberation activists and stalwarts, the future of Africa will not, the Agenda 2063, unfortunately, will not be achieved. So as we look at ourselves now in this age and this year, 2023, with 40 years lying ahead of us, what is critical? So as we begin, the key one is the unity of Africa. How do we unite? The Organization of African Unity was established to unite the continent and to address the issues of colonization and the effects of colonization, which, as you knew, the focus of colonization and the principle was divide and rule, or divide and conquer. How do we unite as Africans? And this is a key aspect, that requires much thought and various programs that we need to consider. But one is unable to unite with others if you do not unite within yourself, if you do not feel a sense of unity with all of humanity, all of creation within yourself. So it begins with you. Every true leader understands the context that they live in and work in, and that context then informs how one leads. We draw inspiration from the great leaders of this continent and the great kingdoms, the great empires, from the empire of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, Emperor Menelik, in terms of the great battle of Adwa and how Ethiopia was never colonized due to the efforts of great leadership. Once again, there's a call for great leadership. And what is it that we need to do? So given that the inspiration is around unity, how do we unite? It's important for us, for Africans who have been divided for far too long, to come together. As Nelson Mandela stated, we are one people. He had a vision, the Pan-African and the global vision. There's a word called Ubuntu in our culture, which it states that Ubuntu is really about the oneness of all humanity. And Nelson Mandela stated that even though we may be we come from different backgrounds, we are all branches on the same tree of humanity. And this is critical and core to how Africa can begin to unite, by recognizing our humanity and our oneness. The second aspect in terms of peace and security, for Africa to we're looking at, unfortunately, we're dealing with challenges and instability in the continent. There was the age of silencing the guns with the African Union. We have come a long way in addressing the coup d'etats and some of the issues around peace and stability in the continent. However, given that our continent is blessed with abundant resources, mineral and other natural resources, and it's also very strategic, being one of the largest continents, if not the largest continent, and the richest continent in the world today. The scramble for Africa's resources is great. So, how do we ensure peace and security in the continent? One is through very courageous leadership. Nelson Mandela and the great leaders of Africa taught us the importance to have courage, to speak out against all forms of oppression and injustice, and to ensure the liberation of our people. And so, this is a key aspect in terms of peace and security. The other aspect that we need to deal with is being, as protecting our sovereignty as Africa and as African states. Unfortunately, the effects of colonization and neocolonialism is still being seen across the continent. And this requires very strong efforts by the governments, by the civil society, and the private sector to be able to overcome by creating a strong identity of who we are as African people. Our respect for one of Aspiration 5 of Agenda 2063 speaks specifically to an Africa with a strong cultural identity, a common heritage, values, and ethics. And herein requires great work. Unfortunately, one of the key results and effects of colonization was that our cultural identity was affected. People were no longer allowed to, even in certain countries, were not allowed to express their own culture, to respect their own heritage. We didn't know our own histories. And as Nelson Mandela stated, education is the most powerful tool and weapon we have to transform the world and to change the world. So to change our world, the first is education. And this is important, that our education should draw on the great history, the great knowledge, and the great wisdom that lies within Africa. We have to rewrite our curricula to ensure our education should reflect our heritage, it should reflect our values, our beliefs as African people, and it should also reflect the great and showcase the great achievements that the leaders. Africa is known as a cradle of humankind. It is known for some of the most ancient civilizations in this continent that the world knows. And hence it's about learning who we are. The first stage of knowing thyself. For every great leader, before we could lead, we need to lead ourselves. But to lead self, you need to know yourself. And this is what Africa requires. Key is to know ourselves as Africans. Who are we is very important. What is our identity? What do we stand for? What do we believe? What are the values we hold true and that we hold important? And how do we then define our own identity so that we can lead Africa into this next millennium and into the future, 2063. Then in terms of Africa, that is, so one, as you stated, really is education. And this is where much work is required in the homes, in these terms of families, because it's in your family, in your homes that you learn your values. You grow up with the values, you get the sense of your identity that is first formed in your home. And this is responsibility. One of the key aspects in terms of defining the values of Africans is for us to reestablish the family unit. Colonization destroyed families and divided families, and this is where our youth, our children, and our future leaders, future African leaders learn their values is from the home. So this is important, the work that needs to be done in terms of family and as re-establishing families. The fact of when we say knowing thyself, we operate in not just a physical or a mental world, but also a world of emotions and a world of spirituality. So once again, it's important for us to understand who are we as African people in each of these dimensions. another key aspect of developing, and this is the work we do as part of the Leading Like Mandela program. When this, as I mentioned, it was with the blessing of Nelson Mandela in 2012 to continue his legacy in terms of leadership. And as the founder, chief executive officer of the organization, we work with leaders from across the globe, having partnered with the United Nations to drive the Sustainable Development Goals for the 2030 vision, with the Africa Forum, who are our former heads of state in Africa. Some of these leaders, came through from the OAU, and they encapsulate and they hold the wisdom of Africa. They understood the context in which they served, and they understood why certain decisions were taken. But now they have left the baton in our hands now. As Nelson Mandela said, it is in your hands now. So the other is then working with governments across Africa through the AU, the Pan-African Parliament, in which we had recent meetings. But essentially, it's around civil society standing up. The power lies within the people. And that what we learned in South Africa's history was it was when people united and people stood up, that is when we were able to transform the system of oppression in our country. And once again, it's about Africans coming together, and platforms such as the one we're holding today is critical for dialogue, for engagement, for us to understand each other and to support each other in this collaboration. Another key aspect of Agenda 2063 is for Africa to, in terms of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. And once again here, we ask ourselves, what is good governance? We have the Mo Ibrahim Index. We have various understanding of what governance, but governance is ultimately about effective leadership, and transformational leadership that's able to make an impact and be able to transform society to the world we want, to the Africa we want. The other aspect of democracy, Africa has been ruled for millennia and for centuries by great empires and kingdoms, and this has been done sustainably. So we need to understand our model of democracy. What is the African model of democracy? How can it work? Because unfortunately, the current systems of democracy does not support the development of Africa effectively. Whilst the principles are important of democracy, that it's upheld, of justice, social justice, equality, etc., the challenge is the application and how we implement these models of democracy. We find it is not serving Africa and the good governance in Africa. So once again, it's about understanding those. When we talk about the different aspirations, aspiration 2, which is an integrated continent, politically united, and based on the ideals of Pan-Africanism and the vision of the African Renaissance. When we talk about this, how do we unite politically? One is through the African Union, but also understanding how do we ensure peace and stability. And then in terms of Pan-Africanism ideals, we need to define what exactly that means. What does it mean exactly? How does it translate into tangible programs of action and plans that can be implemented? We have been falling behind on a number of these agendas on service delivery, and understandably, we're undergoing global shifts. Africa needs to redefine its relationships with the global community. For example, BRICS, the whole collaboration with BRICS and the shifts that's occurring in the global economic world. One in terms of currencies, the world moving away from the US dollar, the issues around the US in terms of internal issues and political issues within the United States of America, as well as the whole global shifts in terms of power being moved. When we talk about governance and how the world's governance is changing towards South Africa is hosting the BRICS Summit later this year. And it's one of the major issues on our agenda. We also, as you know, our country is being, we've had some challenges with certain countries in terms of inviting the BRICS leaders to the country as well. So where is the freedom that we fought for? ways to define our own sovereignty, to define how we run our own countries and how we run our own continent. When we have to be, almost like where we continue to have to be oppressed, and we have to be advised, and coerced into certain foreign policies and agreements that no longer serve our people or the development of our continent. So once again, very key is how do we unite politically, because unity brings strength, and that will help us to, as a regional bloc, to be able to negotiate and to grow the continent and people into the future. Another key aspect that we're dealing with is in terms of economic growth. With the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and the work that's being done there, it's very important because, as we know, Africa is one of the richest continents in terms of minerals, in terms of natural resources and oil and gas and reserves. So how do we ensure that that wealth is being shared by its people, that the benefits of Africa's growth and development are achieved by its people? We're seeing that our minerals are continued to be, we need to redefine models of governance in terms of how we trade and how we unleash, in terms of the mining sector, but also in terms of beneficiation, and how do we then beneficiate our minerals to be able to become a much powerful and more economically active and a wealthier nation and a much wealthier continent. There's the aspect of, in terms of the economy, what is the African currencies that we would be utilizing? We see how the BRICS countries have shifted away, and a number of other countries, including your powerful Middle Eastern wealthy countries, are also coming onto BRICS, the ASEAN countries within those. So Africa needs to make the decision. Kenya has made certain decisions with that, certain countries, I think 5 African states are ready. So we can see that we're living in an age where global shifts are occurring very fast, very rapidly. And that requires decisive leadership. It requires leadership united across the continent. And it requires civil society and the corporate sector, the business world, the private sector, to also step up and to come together. So I would just then, in terms of given time, there's much for us to speak about and to discuss, but I think the key aspects is unity is critical, courage for us to stand up as African leaders, a strong identity of who we are, rewriting our histories and our education system, leveraging technology so we're able to then leapfrog into the fourth industrial revolution and maximize the impact of communication, unity, utilizing that. A key aspect is media and rewriting our narratives of who we are as Africa, because often the media portrays Africa, as in a manner which is not always positive. Investments, because of the work we do, we work with a number of development partners, from governments, from the UN, from various parts of the world, investors. And the key challenge they always ask, but is there good governance in Africa, or is my investment safe? And yet you find in these very countries, when you look at what's happening in Sudan currently, and the rich oil reserves in South Sudan, and how they can, how do we then bring investment when there's political instability is created, in those regions. We're also dealing with the health challenges in Africa. There's a constant outbreak. We find the COVID has basically shut down the world. South Africa had a very strong lockdown, which has negatively impacted our economy and also social development. So it's biological challenges that we need to address. There's been various reports of biological warfare that's also been utilized globally. And I think as Africa, we need, as our leaders, to look at this very closely, how we protect our people and how do we ensure that whatever we apply here in Africa, the health policies and the healthcare programs are for the best interest of our people. Because oppression comes in many forms. Colonization and the results of that has affected people, one in education, in terms of the healthcare sector, in terms of the media, and in terms of the education system that we're dealing. So there have been various things that we need to now address. And taking ownership of our own media, taking ownership of our healthcare, in the continent. Our indigenous knowledge, Africa is blessed with abundant natural and indigenous medicine. It's about researching those and improving primary health care as well. Very important aspect is how can we improve primary health care through effective nutrition. Agriculture is one of the biggest opportunities in the continent, and this is something we need to focus upon. We have the land, we have the most arable land in the world, and it's important for Africans to deal with this. So without further ado, given the time, I think it's really around celebrating Africa, celebrating and about taking Africa forward, yeah, to Agenda 360. I greet all of you and wish you well. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liaqat. That was an impressive discussion. You made very important points, and I hope many people in the audience will have some questions after we have completed all the presentations. So for the sake of time, I would go straight to the next speaker. The next speaker is Ras.